Welcome back to Athanasius Contra Mundum, an interview series. Today is the 1st of September, 2018, and it's also the Feast of Our Lady of Consolation, which in the traditional rite is a movable feast after the Feast of St. Augustine, or so I'm told. And also, this month is the month of Our Lady of Sorrows, which seems fitting given the crucible that the Church is going through right now, politically, spiritually, and internally, even at the very highest levels. And to talk about this, we are joined today by a very special guest who's repeatedly come on to talk about issues in the Church and theology, philosophy, and other matters. Father Chad Ripperger, thank you, Father, for joining us.
It's good to be back.
And isn't your order specifically dedicated to Our Lady of Sorrows?
Yeah, the actual name is the Societas Matris Dolorissime, or the Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother. So we have a particular devotion to her. The primary reason we chose that title was because during the apparition of Our Lady of Sorrows, there's mention of that those who have a devotion to her under that title, that they and their families would be protected from demonic incursion. So that's why we chose the title.
All right. And of course, as I mentioned, there's trouble brewing at all levels in the Church. But before we even get into that, the last time we had, you gave an interview to us, we were talking about your book, Deliverance Prayers, which we'll have linked down below if anyone's interested in getting it. One of the objections that had been given to it was that it did not contain an imprimatur, although the prayers that were objected to in there actually did have an imprimatur in another book. But so anyway, you'd said that you were working on that. What's the status of that imprimatur now?
Yeah, it was granted about a month and a half ago, and so it does have an imprimatur now from the Archdiocese of Denver, as well as does the Italian version. We are in the process of working on getting a Spanish version of it ready to go, which will also be imprimatur before it's published.
Excellent. So now let's look at the scandals we've seen more and more break, principally surrounding the figure of now former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. So this scandal, it's worsened. Everyone thought, oh yeah, this is dealt with. Everyone acted like 2002, protect our bishop, protect our children. We've dealt with all this. We don't have to deal with it anymore. Now we get the revelations of McCarrick, that he not only harassed and forced his way with the number of adults, but also at least one case that's been admitted to by the church authorities in New Jersey, I think it was, or New York, where he did violate a child as well. Now he's been stripped. And now you have the grand jury report in Pennsylvania, which, although there's certain things where they are kind of tinkering with the process or giving you just allegations, on the other hand, one thing they showed absolutely was that bishops had been covering up for this crisis and ignoring the authorities, trying to stonewall for the statute of limitations to run it. And you see this specifically Donald Wuerl, Cardinal Wuerl, responsible for a lot of this, and as well as other bishops, Troutman and people like that. People you knew from their past dealings were bad news anyway, at least again in my estimation. So we get that. They're covering up for the abuse, and now we have allegations the Pope himself knew about and covered for McCarrick. How did we get there? How did we get to this situation where we have cardinals covering up for abuse and sending priests out of the country, where even the Pope is now alleged to have had knowledge that a man was an abuser and still promoted him up higher?
Well, I think there's numerous causes. Before I kind of get into those, I think that it's understandable why the lay people are so angry, really, at this point, because of the fact that there is a perception of insincerity on the side of the bishops when they got together in Dallas and put out the charter, et cetera, that they basically, it was more grandstanding than anything else. And I think we'll get more into that, why I personally think that that's actually one of the things that was happening. I think there's some bishops that were serious about it. They took it more seriously, but there's still a particular issue which I think that even some of the best bishops haven't been addressing. There's a few that have, but most haven't. But I think that there's a bit of perception of insincerity on the side of the bishops. They apologized, and then they just turned around and did it again, and now they're apologizing again. And I think that apologies are considered a bit insincere at this stage. But I'll kind of return to that just a little bit. As far as the causes, I think generally speaking, one of the primary causes is modernism, in the sense that we're still beset by the modernist heresy, where the principle of criteria of what you believe religiously, and that includes morals, is the immanentist principle, which basically means that a person judges whether something is true or not based upon their own internal dispositions or judgment or perceptions or even concepts in relationship to reality, rather than they're conforming their intellect to reality. Of course, truth is conforming the conformity of the intellect to reality or to the thing, as St. Thomas defines it. And so there's been, since that shift has happened, what's happened is when it came time to judge the suitability of seminarians, or even about whether priests should remain in the priesthood or who was suitable for the priesthood, it shifted from the objective criteria, which we'll be getting into, but it shifted from the objective criteria, which the church had set out for millennia, literally. And then what happens is it shifted from that to a subjective criteria. And so they started judging these guys based upon how they felt about these men, or even their own proclivities. In some cases, those who were in charge of the seminaries, etc., were judging that. And so instead of using the objective criteria and conforming themselves to that, which is part of this whole modernist problem, that's what you end up with. Also, as you well know, because you're quite a historian yourself, with most heresies, there's also a concomitant collapse of the moral life in that, and that same thing has happened here. Modernism is a synthesis of all heresies, and that includes moral heresy, and that's actually what we're seeing when it comes to the judgment of the suitability of candidates for the priesthood and even being seminarians. That is the moral heresy, too, just in relationship to matters that pertain to the conjugal act, in the sense that the church has always followed the natural law and how that is to be structured. Once people have deviated from that, then you end up in this situation where we are now, where you actually have some Catholics think it's okay for gay marriage and things of that sort. So that collapse, the natural law collapse, actually occurred in the 40s and 50s, because modernism set in not in the last century, but the century before. It started setting in, and by the time you got to the 40s and 50s, there had been a collapse in the natural law. Before that was a collapse in ecclesiology, and then before that was the collapse of in Scripture. So all those things kind of culminate, so that by the time you get to the 40s and 50s, when they're coming back, especially from the Second World War, the criteria for these men was basically lessened, and the man entering the seminary very often didn't have the requisite qualities necessary to be a good seminarian or a priest. There also, and so what happened over the course of time is, especially by the time you get after the Second Vatican Council, although obviously nothing in the Second Vatican Council discusses this directly, the fact of the matter is that by the time you get after the Second Vatican Council, they come up with this idea that it's okay to have a homosexual in the priesthood as long as he is chaste. Again, I'll address that a little bit later. Then, of course, then they started allowing unchaste men into the seminaries and things of that sort. And so there was a systemic neglect on the side of those in charge of the seminaries to keep these men out who didn't have that. One of the things that the church has always said is that one of the supernatural signs of a vocation, one of the necessary qualities of someone just even entering the seminary, being in the seminary, is that he had to have habitual chastity. That is, he could not be falling into grave matter regarding the 6th or 9th commandments. And so he had to have that before he even began the process of formation. It's not something that, as we'll see a little bit later, is not something to be taken up in the seminary. It's something that's to be done before they enter the seminary. And then, of course, once that all collapsed, then there was, just allowing the homosexuals into the priesthood. The bishops, whose primary obligation it is to make sure that the seminary formation is being done properly, there was systemic neglect on the side of many bishops, a lot of omissions. The bishops themselves very often had problems in this area and still do. And so this is not all of them, of course, because some of them are very chaste men, but some of them are not. And so they would allow these men into the seminaries. This is one of the reasons why I often tell people that you can't allow them into the seminary, even if they are chaste, which, again, we'll get to why a little bit later. But one of the reasons is because then they're soft on the men who aren't chaste. In other words, they have a harder time maintaining that discipline and that stringent requirements for the qualities of the seminarian because of their own difficulties and things that they struggle with. I think one of the other difficulties that we're dealing with now that we're at 2018 with this problem arising with McCarrick and Worrell and the Holy Father, etc. I think that, again, apologizing is a necessary thing, but it has to be sincere, and it's not enough. Apologizing isn't enough. Doing the investigations is necessary. They have to do it, but it's not enough. In other words, if the bishops are just going to do these things and go on as business as usual and not root the men that have difficulties with chastity out of the seminaries, if they're just going to go on as business as usual, all the apologizing and all the investigations are fruitless, pointless in the end, and all they're going to do is aggravate the laity, which has actually happened. And so in the end, they're going to have to really, the problem has to be resolved. The only real way that the problem can be resolved is that they actually have to start excluding homosexuals and those men who are unchaste from the seminary as a general principle. Part of this also just has to do, we'll see this when we get to the priesthood. The priesthood stands at the altar, which means that he's supposed to be offering an unblemished sacrifice, himself being part of that sacrifice. And if that's the case, then he himself can't have any grave moral defects. And so they have to do due diligence to make sure these men don't have this problem before they enter the seminary. If they do, that has to get completely cleaned up before there's any further consideration of them. The other part of it is that there was a systemic rejection of the tradition regarding the criteria about what is required for the seminary, for a seminarian and even for the clergy. If you look at the Fifth Vatican Council, it actually issued the decree that says, quote, let any member of the clergy caught in that vice against nature. Now here they're talking about sodomitical acts. That is, they're actually talking about sins of homosexuality. Let any member of the clergy caught in that vice against nature, given that the wrath of God falls over the sons of perfidy, be removed from the clerical order or forced to do penance in a monastery. In other words, the Fifth Lateran Council, and this is from a council. We're not talking about just some opinion of some bishops or just, a little bit of speculation here and there. We're talking about a council of the church has said that if they do those kinds of things, they should be removed from the clerical order or forced to do penance in a monastery, which basically means removing them from the public sector so that they can't have an influence in the general life of the church. Then, of course, we have Pius V in the Constitution Horrendum Illud Scelus says, quote, we determine that they should be handed over to the severity of the secular authority. Now, here he's talking about, again, clergy that have these particular difficulties. Here specifically, those things that pertain to homosexuality and things of that sort. We establish that any priest or member of the clergy, either secular or regular, who commits such an execrable crime, by force of the present law, be deprived of every clerical privilege. In other words, you remove him from the priesthood, you basically strip him of any status, of every post, dignity, and ecclesiastical benefit, and having been degraded by an ecclesiastical judge, in other words, once he's been judged that this is the case, he's removed from all those things, let him be immediately delivered over to the secular authority as mandated by the law as the fitting punishment for laymen who have sunk into this abyss. Now, today that would sound extremely harsh and completely over the top, but here you're talking about in an age where there was clarity about matters that pertain to the sixth and ninth commandments, and we're not living in an age where this stuff is pandemic within the culture. Rather, this was a recognition of this vice is a sin that cries to heaven for vengeance, and so it cannot be tolerated in any manner whatsoever within the priesthood. Then, in a different document, which is one that I've been trying to promote as the solution to actually the problem that we're going through right now, is Religiosorum Institutio, which was put out by the Congregation for Religious at the approval of John the 23rd. And in there, he says in paragraph 18, the congregation says, confessors have the grave duty of warning, urging, and ordering unfit subjects, privately and in conscience, with no regard for human respect, to withdraw from religious and clerical life. Now, here you're talking about those people, the men who are unchaste or have a problem with homosexuality. So they're talking about that they have to be privately and in conscience told, you have to withdraw from the clerical life. And we'll talk about this clerical life a little bit later, because they moved the clerical status from the beginning of the seminary life until the diaconate, which also creates its own sets of problems. And it goes on. Although they may appear to have all the dispositions required for sacramental absolution. Okay, so They might be sorry for their sin, and so you can absolve them. They are, he goes on, nevertheless, not for that reason to be regarded as worthy of profession or ordination. The principles governing the sacramental form, especially those pertinent to the absolution of sins, are different from the criteria whereby, according to the mind of the Church, judgment is formed on the fitness of the priesthood and religious life. Consequently, penitents who are certainly unworthy of profession, and by there he's talking about professing of the vow of chastity. How can you take a vow of chastity if you can't live chastely, is basically what is being said here. Who are certainly unworthy of professional ordination can be absolved if they show proof of true sorrow for their sins, just as it would be in any kind of absolution. But it goes on, and seriously promise to drop the idea of going on to the religious and clerical state, but they must be effectively barred from profession and ordination. Essentially, what that document mandated was that a seminarian who, if he had fallen into a grave sin against the sixth or ninth commandments, that basically, although they do make some specifications about what that's supposed to mean, if he falls into that, and it's clear that this is going to be a problem he's going to struggle with, then you basically are not to give absolution to him unless he is willing to drop the idea of continuing on in the seminary or in the monastery. This is pretty serious business. And part of this was for the Church to protect those states, that is, the religious life and the clerical state, from men who weren't worthy. One of the problems that happened after Vatican II is they began this, allowing them into the seminary, saying, well, we'll work with them and form them so that they get better. But in paragraph 7 of that same document, Religiosorum Institutio, it says they said that one of the problems that was occurring in the seminary is that those running it hoped the subjects would do better in the future. No, the question, and this is what they're basically saying in that document, it's not that you have hope that they're going to do better in the future. They have to show it now to continue on into that state, to be a worthy recipient of holy orders, and also to take a proper vow of chastity. Paragraph 29 goes on and says, among the proofs and signs of a divine vocation, the virtue of chastity is regarded as absolutely necessary. In other words, that's what I was mentioning in the beginning of this interview. The virtue of chastity, that is leading a habitual, because a virtue is a habit, a habitual life of chastity, which basically means you're never falling into grave matter regarding the sixth and ninth commandments, was considered a necessary sign to be even in the seminary, let alone to become a priest. Should superiors, the paragraph goes on, should superiors find a candidate unable to observe ecclesiastical celibacy and practice priestly chastity, then completely ignoring any other outstanding qualities. Doesn't matter how nice of a guy is, doesn't matter how intelligent he is, doesn't matter how good he is at his studies, what he's contributing to the seminary, or what have you. They go on to say they should bar him from the religious life and the priesthood. Finally, one last quote is from paragraph 30. A candidate who shows himself certainly unable to observe religious and priestly chastity, either because of frequent sins against chastity or because of a sexual bent of mind or excessive weakness of will, is not to be admitted to the minor seminary, and much less to the novitiate or to profession. So they were never allowed to go. You can't. And one of the big mistakes, and this is what they said you're not to do, is people have this idea, well, once they become a priest or once they take the vow, they'll have grace of state. And so they'll have the graces to remain chaste. No, but here's the problem is, yeah, they'll be getting extra graces, but they'll also be under greater attack spiritually by the devil, but also the temptations can be even more severe. But they have to have shown that they can actually take the vow, that they can actually render that vow, which is a promise towards God that they will live chastely, that they can actually render that before God. They said no one should be admitted to perpetual vows or promoted to sacred orders unless he has acquired a firm habit of continency and has given every case consistent proof of habitual chastity over a period of at least 1 year. If within this year, prior to perpetual professional ordination to sacred orders, doubt should arise about because of new faults, the candidate to be barred from perpetual profession or sacred orders. If a student in a minor seminary has sinned gravely against the sixth commandment with a person of the same or the other sex, or has been the occasion of grave scandal in the matter of chastity, he is to be dismissed immediately, as stipulated in Canon 1371. Of course, that's the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Advantage to religious vow, advantage, that is to advance to, an ordination should be barred to those who are afflicted with evil tendencies to homosexuality or pederasty, since for them the common life and priestly ministry would constitute serious dangers. So if you look at tradition of the church, it was very clear. There was a set of criteria that was required for a man to become a priest. Not just chastity, but he had to have a certain level of intelligence, he had to have a certain level of virtue in other areas, etc., in order for him to be ordained. Basically, if you read this, what comes through, and if you read what the authors, the spiritual authors say, no man should be admitted to the priesthood, or let alone be in the seminary, if he has some grave moral defect, whether it's chastity or some other thing. And we would think this is obviously the case. And part of this has to do, again, with the necessity of those who offer the august sacrifice of the Mass have to be worthy of being able to stand at that altar and not to be struggling with grave matter. So I think it has to do with the heresies. I think it has to do with neglect of the bishops, those in the seminary, and then also just a rejection of what the church is, the traditional criteria that the church has always established. I think that's how we're at now with the problems that we have now. Once the homosexuals got in, then that's once they got in, then they just perpetuated it. They got into positions of power, and then in the end, they ended up using that power and abusing that power. There is obviously some tangential reasons too. We know from congressional records that, according to Bella Dodd, that she had, when she gave her congressional testimony, that she managed to get 1,000 seminarians from communist institutions. This is not conspiracy theory. This is right on congressional record from the woman who actually was part of the process that did that. Historically, if you talk to people who are experts in communism and things of that sort, the communists were very often using the homosexuals. They were recruiting homosexuals precisely for this process. So there's that part of it as well. So there's a whole series of things that kind of came to the leading of this, but I think in the end, it ultimately came down to good men not practicing due diligence.
And especially because, the documents you've mentioned are not mere, one-off things or something nobody ever heard of. These were commonly known, and then on top of that, the constitutions of Lateran V, Pope St. Pius V, they were known and promulgated again by Pope Benedict XIV back in the 18th century in Sacramentis Constitution Sacramentum Penitentiae, which covers various penal laws that are to be put into place for those in the clerical state committing some kind of heinous act, particularly homosexual in nature. You have also the 1917 canon law, which embodies all of these same things you mentioned previously. Also, canon 2359. Let me read it. So this is the 1917 canon law. This was the law in the 50s, 60s, and 70s until 1983, when a lot of these abuse cases went on, when we know homosexuality was taking place in the seminaries, and we know people like Bishop Rembert Weekland, now we know former Cardinal McCarrick, were actively engaging in homosexual activity that was known to their superiors.
Right.
Canon 2359 of the 1917 Code, Article 2, says, my translation, if clerics or clergy engage in a delictum against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue with a minor below the age of 16, or take part in adultery, debauchery, bestiality, sodomy, pandering, incest with affinity, that is, with blood with your kin, blood relatives within the first degree, they are suspended, declared infamous, and are deprived of any office, benefice, dignity, responsibility, if they have such, and whatever, and in more serious cases, they are to be deposed. So
Right.
the canon already has it laid down, not just for, so in the first case they mention, obviously, some kind of pedophilia or ebophilia. But then even, adultery, debauchery, but sodomy, whatever, in that category, even with adults, two consenting adults, it was a canonical crime, and all
Right.
of these men should have been dismissed rather than made bishops, seminary rectors, cardinals, etc.
Right. That's absolutely right.
So, and that's no. I imagine it's probably not too much of a jump in logic to wonder why that was removed from the 1983 canon, because the guys who are removing it are, of course, the guys practicing it.
Yeah, and I think that part of it also has to do with the perception, especially in the last 50 or 60 years. Some of it is this falsified mercy business where, oh, you have to have mercy on these people. That's fine. You do. That's what the sacrament of confession is for. But as regard the clerical and the religious state, the church has a grave obligation. The members, especially of the hierarchy and of the magisterium, have a grave obligation to protect the purity of those states. And so this is, the fact that they systemically neglected their obligation and ignored it was itself grave. I think this is one of the reasons why the lay people are reacting so much, because the lay people have a sensus fidelium. They know that priests or if a man has a problem with the sixth or ninth commandment, he has no business being in the seminary in the priesthood, generally speaking. And so that's one of the reasons why the church was very serious about this stuff, because of the fact that it not just caused grave scandal and harm, which is one of the gravest things that's happening here, but it also, once it gets into the priesthood, which we've even seen this historically in the life of the church, once it gets into the priesthood, it starts to spread and it becomes a contagion that requires very severe ways of cleaning it up, because it cannot be soft-handled, unfortunately.
So just prior to the release of Bishop Vigano's testimony, Pope Francis, or at least those writing his speeches, in conjunction with Cardinal Wuerl, Cardinal Cupich, Bishop McElroy, also bishops in Ireland, bishops in Latin America, bishops in other places addressing the abuse crisis, they all declared, almost as if it was all coordinated, that this is the result of clericalism, and I use sneer quotes here, clericalism, that we must all work now to make reparation for what they did, actually. But anyway, isn't this notion that it's all, and we heard this back, and I remember in 2002 with the Dallas Charter, again, there were people saying this is all because of clericalism, and Weekland was out there, clericalism. And back in 1984 in Rudy Koss, although I was too young then, but I was researching it. And again, at the same thing, the big meeting they had in 84 after the Rudy Koss scandal, it was clericalism. This word keeps showing up. It's like that line in Princess Bride, that what again? I don't think it means what you think it means. So what exactly is clericalism? Is this just a nice anomalous term that you can use to shift responsibility onto a faceless entity for 5 minutes of hate? Or is there actually something deeper in the use of the word clericalism by the aforementioned figures?
Yeah, well, it is an anomalous term. Actually, in fact, there's several definitions of the term clericalism, even in a historical level. So if you look at the Collins Dictionary, it just means political influence or power of the clergy, or a policy of principles that favor this. Or another one is a policy of supporting the power and influence of the clergy in political and secular matters. Ironically, the very people who are saying clericalism are the very ones getting involved more in politics in matters that they really shouldn't be in. They should just be setting the general moral principles for the politicians to follow, rather than trying to actually get involved in the politics on specific policy matters, really. I mean, historically, the only time they would step into a policy historically was if a political policy, as if it was grave matter. Another definition is a system, spirit, or methods of the priesthood. It just meant, or sacerdotalism, it just meant clericalism didn't necessarily have a negative connotation in some cases. It just meant that it was in order to maintain the spirit and methods, and even the spirit, we mean the spirituality and life of the priesthood. Wikipedia, not that that's necessarily a perfect source, but Wikipedia calls clericalism is also used to describe the cronyism and cloistered political environments of hierarchical religions. Now, that's an interesting definition. Described the cronyism and cloistered political environments of hierarchical religions. Ironically, the homosexual network in the clergy is that. They're using the actual their clerical status to maintain what they're actually doing.
I was going to say, it sounds like the last 60 years.
Exactly. But normally, sometimes clericalism is used within the church to refer to the view that clerics are special in a manner that certain privileges and dignities should be granted them that are not truly part or proper to their clerical state. In other words, a clericalist is like a priest who's a clericalist is usually somebody who wants a kind of deference and treatment from the laity that's not really proper to his state. And usually it's to the denigration of the lay state. So usually that's what it is. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to treat a priest with certain privileges and dignities, etc., but there's certain ones that are proper to his state. And I think that he obviously has to be treated with respect, but he must not appropriate that dignity to himself. It is something that is be given to Christ rather than to himself. And he must not seek to be treated in a manner that is above his state or not proper to it. And this is one of the problems that you actually, that you can see. However, that particular problem, in my experience, is not the cause of the homosexual problem. Unless you're talking about the other clericalism, which we talked about, this cronyism in cloistered political environments and the hierarchical religions. That I could legitimately see as it's a problem of clericalism, because these guys got into the clerical state and they're setting up these institutions or structures to keep themselves protected while they're carrying on in this bad behavior. But I think overall, the general sense of the lay people when they heard the response of Cardinal Wuerl specifically, the response that the real problem was clericalism, people just thought that's completely inept. This has nothing to do with the problem. The problem has to do with the fact that priests aren't chaste. That's the difficulty that we're struggling with here.
So we've talked about McCarrick, Weakland, Bishop Weakland's the other one, that we know publicly were homosexuals, or did engage in homosexual acts. Yet they're priests. And you alluded to this a little bit earlier, that the priesthood is not just a job. It's not your career. You're not a social worker wearing a collar backwards. You actually have a sacred function. Your person, your actual, you get a character on your soul, conforming you to Christ. And that's actually the greatest of the three characters you get, sacramentally speaking. So what is how is the Catholic priesthood theologically defined? We focused on the negative. Let's look at what we should be and what our priests should be. So what precisely is the Catholic priesthood that sets it apart from, say, being a Protestant minister or vicar or what have you?
Yeah, it's right in Scripture. So if we read in Hebrews 8:3, St. Paul says that for every priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. The gifts are obviously to God. It's oblata, so it's offered to God, and sacrifices. So the very nature of the priesthood, and we also know this from the Old Testament, that the Old Testament priests were satisfied. They were the ones who specifically offered the sacrifice in the temple. So the very structure and nature of the priesthood, its identity revolves around offering sacrifice to God in propitiation for his own sins and for the sins of the others. Everything else that he does, everything in his priesthood, the hearing of confessions, anointing, etc., is all ultimately ordered towards that preparing or disposing people for the reception of the benefits of that sacrifice. And so it all ultimately it's ordered towards sacrifice. The other aspect of this is we even know this from the Mass. The principal function of the priest is to offer Mass towards to God the Father, again in propitiation for his sins and the sins of those present and for the universal church. That is the key thing of the identity of the priest. That is what the Catholic priesthood is. It is granted to a particular man to offer sacrifice. That's its primary thing. St. Thomas says, if you want to talk more philosophically or theologically, he says it's an indelible mark in the possible intellect. That's part of the intellect which is immaterial. It's the intellect which has the ability to command things to be done. So he says it's an indelible mark in the possible intellect which gives the priest the power to command the sacraments to occur. He doesn't ask God to change the bread bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. He commands the bread to change. And so this is the principal function of the priesthood, is to offer sacrifice. All those other things that he commands in relationship to the other sacraments are ordered towards that command. So the Catholic priesthood is ultimately revolves around the very nature of it is to offer sacrifice to God the Father.
So how has the priest been set apart in society throughout the history of the church? We have this theological definition of what he is and how he uses the sacramental power. How has the church accorded a place to the priest? And is this what some people are talking about when they decry the things as being clericalism?
Well, I think that Well, historically, he's set aside in this sense, in the sense that he himself has to step away from the world. He has to set himself aside from working in the world and having things that pertain to the worldly matters in order, because his function now is sacred. The priesthood itself is sacred, that is in him. And so he is just set aside just by virtue of having the indelible mark. He's set aside as being different from everybody else. Now, that difference, even though he's higher in the sacramental order, it doesn't necessarily mean he's holier than a layman or something, or more virtuous than a layman or something of that sort. But it does set him aside as being distinct, because he no longer pursues the things that pertain to the world, and he is to pursue those things that pertain to God and to the service of God. This is also why the church established the clerical state. And the clerical state was basically setting men aside specifically for the pursuit of those things that were sacred and holy. Historically, the clerical state, and this is something I wanted to mention, historically, the clerical state was done usually about the first year after the first year in the seminary, when the candidate had shown himself worthy of being able to lead the life of the clerical state, which was primarily chastity and having sufficient virtue to be a cleric. They actually went through tonsure, and if you look at the ritual of tonsure, the actual name of it is the order of making a cleric. And once you entered into the clerical state after the first year of your seminary life, then you had a change of state, and that change of state meant that you actually received the grace of state. That grace of state was one of the principal things it was ordered towards, was leading a chaste life. So the church in the very beginning set it up so that after they had demonstrated they could live chastely, then they gave them the clerical state, which would help them to lead an easier chaste life through the course of their entire seminary formation. Unfortunately, when he suppressed the minor orders, the clerical state later was then, and especially in the 1983 Code of Canon Law, was subsumed with the diaconate. So basically, they were taking away from the seminarians all the graces that they would have received from that grace of state to lead a chaste life during their seminary life. It would have made it easier for them to do so and to advance in that chastity, which is an unfortunate state. So that clerical state was also to set aside, one, to give them chastity, but it was also to set them aside in their own minds. That they had to recognize that their identity now, their life was going to no longer be their own when they became a priest, and that their identity was going to revolve around God primarily. And so that they had to set aside the things that pertain to the world. It is true that the church would give him certain dignities and honors, but the church was rather measured in those kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons why when priests would try and take on those being treated in a way that was above and beyond what their actual state was inappropriate. Another thing, which is something that I've talked to some priests about, and there's a concern growing among some of the priests, and that is that historically, because the mandate of Christ to the apostles and their successors was go and teach all nations, it was generally considered that the mandate of the church, the divine positive law given to the church, took precedence over the natural law rights in relationship to countries, in relationship to matters that pertain to religion, as far as the church was concerned. What does that mean concretely? It meant that the church had a right, that the Catholic Church had the right to go and teach straight from God, to teach the gospel to all nations. As a result of that, it was generally considered in most countries that the priests, whose function it was to assist the bishop in that function, that they were not subject to the civil authorities. Did they have to follow the civil law? Yes, they did, as a matter of prudence. Also, as a matter of that the civil authorities did have, in justice, the right to determine certain matters, but not others. And so, as a result of that, the priests were not subject to the civil authorities, except for when they were remanded by their bishops. The concern that priests are starting to have is if every time there's a problem with a priest, they immediately sent him to the civil authorities, rather than swiftly and adequately and strictly dealing it with themselves and putting an end to actually putting an end to the problem, what's going to happen over the course of time, which you're actually seeing. I mean, I just watched it just recently on television. There was a newscaster who's basically saying that it's time for the civil authorities to step in and tell the church this is what they have to do, right? And so what's happening is through this process, the actual dignity of the church itself is being degraded by the fact that priests are acting badly and the civil authorities are stepping in to protect the common good, which is their legitimate right. But it has to be understood that that has to be circumscribed by the natural law. They don't have the right to start telling the church what it can and cannot do. However, it does have a right to protect its citizens from these kinds of priests and bishops if that's what's happening. The point I'm drawing out in this is that the priest was not subject to the civil authorities in certain matters. However, what's happening today is that even that's being eroded. So the proper setting aside of the priest is being eroded. So you got that problem on one side. And then you got the other problem on the other side where the bishops were, ironically, practicing clericalism, where they weren't taking proper care of these, or dealing with these priests and dealing with them properly. And when they should have been remanding them to the civil authorities for prosecution, they weren't doing it when they should have. So I think that there is a problem on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. But historically, the church did set him aside because of his sacred character, that his sacred character didn't mean that he would be subject to the civil authorities in the same manner, unless the bishops themselves remanded them to them.
We'll get to the minor orders actually in a little bit, but for the moment, so with the setting apart of the priest in society, there's also, it's only been preserved in the Latin Church, celibacy for the priest, as we've mentioned before, that in his very formation, the priest has to show that he can be chaste, and which pertaining to his state in life, which is also completely celibate. Now, a lot of people say, well, look, you got this clerical scandal because of celibacy, because all these priests, are celibate. Why don't we end mandatory celibacy and just allow all those priests to get married, or allow married men to be ordained, etc.? Now, I think we've touched about this in a previous interview, but just again, is celibacy part of the problem? And what would be the practical consequences for ending it?
Well, obviously, celibacy isn't the problem. The problem is the lack of being celibate among those who have been abusing children and other people. This is the problem. It's the actual lack of celibacy that's the problem. And it's the lack of not vetting the seminarians properly that's the problem. So celibacy isn't the problem. If all the priests were leading good celibate lives, we wouldn't be having a scandal right now. But to answer the second part of your question, consequently, if they ended celibacy, first of all, if people are complaining about the scandal now, you're going to have not just that scandal, because that type of scandal is going to continue until the bishops address it properly. But then if you let the priests marry, you're going to have other problems. How are you going to deal with divorce among the clergy, or bad marriages among the clergy that will become evident to the lay people, or the bad acting of children, right, of the priests? You see this among the Protestant ministers. They have this very problem. You also have the problem of the wife of the priest being a target by the lay people, because they know that if they can influence her, then maybe he'll influence the priest, etc. And also the wife may end up being too influential in determining the aspects of the priest. The second thing is that if you allow the priest to marry, either his marriage is going to suffer or his priesthood is going to suffer. You can't have a man totally dedicated to God and still be married, because what's going to happen is if his wife gets sick or one of his children gets sick and he's got to run to the hospital because someone's dying, someone is going to have to pay the price somewhere in that. And so we can't split the life of the priest. He has to have that perfect total dedication to God. This is also going to increase the financial burden of the church, because you're going to have to start paying them a living wage. You're not going to be able to have many priests living in the same rectory. You're going to have them all living separately. So there's going to be that. The next thing is he's going to be less available spiritually, because he's going to have the obligations of his wife and his family to take care of. I one time talked to Father Luis Bouillet, who was a paradist at the Second Vatican Council, who wasn't particularly happy with how things went after the council. But I asked him about, because he had a lot of interaction with the Easterns, and I asked him how married clergy was going with Easterns, and he made the observation it wasn't going very well because in some of the Eastern churches, the lay people didn't want to go to confession to a married priest because they were too concerned about his relationship with his wife. So I think that if we allow that, it's not going to solve if we remove celibacy and allow priests to marry, it's only going to add more problems to what we're actually dealing with. The other thing we have to remember is that and I've read this in 3 different studies. Statistically, the number of priests that commit pedophilia is, according to these statistics, 1.25. The general population is 2.75. The Protestant ministers have the same rate as the general population. So actually, it's not going to solve the problem if you're looking at it purely from a statistical point of view. So I don't think that removing celibacy will solve the problem. I think it will simply add more problems to the mix.
And financially, I think that's at least for some people who chafe at the church's tradition or the apostolic tradition of it. I know that in the Ruthenian diocese where I attend liturgy or eparchy properly, the bishop there brought in a number of married priests some years back. Well, that started to bear fruit in as much as the insurance is going up for the whole eparchy. And it's becoming a huge burden. In fact, now there's a bunch of lawsuits over it because it's become such a burden, and there might be some fraud involved. But either way, having these married priests come in has significantly raised all the clergy insurance to the point where the eparchy is having a hard time affording it. It's a smaller eparchy, even a wider territorial area, but it's a smaller, there's fewer numbers of priests. And if that happened in a Latin diocese, where all of a sudden you almost double who's covered by insurance, you're going to almost double, more or less, the insurance prices. At least it stands to reason. And that's just dealing with insurance, and like you said, well, all the other things too. And so you think they're demanding too much money now as they're asking to avoid selling their $1 million penthouses and whatnot for abuse settlements. Just wait till, we need to pay for the the pastor's wife, or the priest's wife and kids, and their soccer games and their second car, and because that's how normal families function. You need 2 vehicles. You need and then when those costs hit home, all of a sudden it's not so much of an attractive, at least to a normal person, it wouldn't be so much of an attractive proposition.
Right. That's right.
Well, anyway. So, continuing on, historically, how has the liturgy formed the priest? So the priest is up at the altar, and he's not just a sacramental pez dispenser, which is your phrase that I'm borrowing. He's actually, there's something around him that governs his actions and also presents his actions to the community. So how does that form the priest?
Well, ultimately, it has to do with the principles that govern the liturgy. Let me back up just a little bit. I think that we're talking about his identity is ultimately formed by the particular principles that govern the liturgy, that is, the liturgy itself. So let's just give a few examples. The first is the focus on God. So, like in the ancient rite of Mass, what happens is the priest says Mass ad orientem, although you can do that also in the new rite. But the focus when it's ad orientem is on God. It's theocentric rather than anthropocentric, and so the focus is on God. So just the fact where he's directing himself gives him a focus, and it sets a principle in his mind about what the liturgy is about, what he is about in relationship to that, what his relationship is to God. And as a result of that, his identity, because of that orientation, his identity becomes one with God in the sense that he sees himself ultimately only in relationship to God. That's what a priest ultimately has to do. St. Paul said, when we see God face to face, he will be all in all. In other words, the priest himself has to start working on that, and the liturgy will contribute to that if its focus is on God. This is also true just about the prayers of the liturgy. If it's focused on God, if it's ultimately that the whole thing is an offering given to him, etc., then that focus of the priest has a fulfillment. A priest, because he is ordained, has a grace estate, and that grace inclines him to want to perform those things that pertain to a priest. And so many priests who start saying the ancient rite of Mass say that there's a fulfillment in their priesthood that they're getting that they weren't getting before. And so as a result of that, a lot of that has to do with the focus on the Mass has to do with God. And it's obviously offered for the people, but it's offered to God, and so God is ultimately the focus. St. Thomas says that from the cross, Christ preached all the virtues. And we see this, actually. So, for example, the fact that he refused to consume the gall was a sign of temperance. The fact that obviously it's an act of fortitude. It's an act of supernatural prudence because it's the means by which we're all going to be saved, etc. It's obviously part of the virtue of justice, of the sub-virtue of religion, of which there's the act of sacrifice. That is ultimately what it is. And so he preached all the virtues from the cross. The same thing should be able to be said about a particular rite of the Mass. And this is one of the beauties of the ancient rite of Mass. It teaches the priest humility. Throughout the course of it, he's constantly humbling himself. There are certain things where he's recognizing his own sins and his own sinfulness. It's also a sacrifice. The priest has to sacrifice himself in saying the ancient rite of Mass by virtue of the fact that he has to conform himself to everything from where his hands are positioned to when he's praying, when he's actually putting things in the chalice. His hands have to be in a particular location. When he turns around and faces the people, he's not to look at them. He's to keep his eyes down, which is custody of the eyes, which is part of modesty. So the modesty is replete throughout the whole thing. Obviously, there's a certain fortitude because it takes a lot of focus and intention and a lot of self-denial in performing it. And prudence, because the church, you have to have a certain docility, which is a sub-virtue to prudence, because you have to have a docility to say the Mass as the church tells you how to say the Mass. There's an intimacy that a priest has when he confects the Eucharist, because he is literally right there. He's holding the bread as it's transubstantiating. When the bread is transubstantiating, there's an intimacy that he has with God, because he's literally holding him in his fingers as God is becoming present through the transubstantiation. And the fact that the prayers of consecration, the old writer said sotto voce, loud enough so that he and the server can hear it, but so that it will be confected. There's an intimacy that he has with God in that. Whereas if he's just saying it out loud, etc., that intimacy gets affected. They used to say that the priest enjoyed the first fruits of the Mass, because he would be, by very offering of the Mass, he would receive the graces from it. It's not necessarily the primary fruits, but it is the first fruits. The other part of it is that he has to recognize that the liturgy isn't his own. He has to die to it. It should not be something where there are a variety of different options where it becomes his own making. It should be something that he submits to in humility. And so there should be very meager options allowed. This is why in the old rite, the primary options that were allowed were actually allowed in the choice of the Mass. The primary ones were outside of Mass. So if it was a fourth class feria, then you could basically choose to do a votive Mass. But once you chose to do the votive Mass, you were locked in. You could allow certain commemorations as well by your choice, but once you've chosen, you're locked in. It's not the type of thing that you literally make it up as you go, because there has to be that recognition of the priest that my job is to serve God by offering the sacrifice to him, sacrificing myself, sacrificing my own desires, practicing that self-denial in relationship to what I'm doing in union with Christ, who is, of course, we're participating that at Mass. When we talk about the identity crisis of the priests today, I think one of it has to do with the negation of a number of those things, especially the reduction of the sacrificial aspects of the Mass. The fact that the priest no longer sees the Mass as a sacrifice, but as a meal primarily, changes his whole identity, changes his view. Also, there's a lack of doctrinal teaching in the seminaries. The priests are coming out of the seminaries today without a total formation about what the priesthood is, the dogmas of the church, all those things. Very often priests come out and they know less about it than the teachings of the church than the laity. There's not a formation of his mind. There's another problem with, ironically, after the Second Vatican Council, there's been an increase in loading the priest up with non-sacerdotal work, attending meetings and committees. He's basically becoming a CEO, etc., and things of that sort. Then, of course, there's the seminal article called The Emasculation of the Priesthood, written by Father McLucas, where he talks about the fact that with the current situation, the priest confess the Eucharist, and then all of a sudden you have this convergence of lay ministers coming up, taking the host and running off with them, and he doesn't even get to feed his own people very often, or if he does, he has no control over that, because part of his spiritual fatherhood is to be able to protect the sacraments. This is why in the past, the church didn't use the word steward, at least in any of the manuals that I've read. They never used the word steward. They used the word custodian, coming from the Greek word and the Latin word custos, which basically means the one who protected. He was the custodian of the sacraments. So not only did he dispense them, but it is his obligation to protect them. And that's being stripped from the priest because he doesn't have any control, basically, over how once he confessed the Eucharist, for example, what happens to the hosts, etc. Very often. Obviously, some priests are diligent about that, etc., but it's still a problem. So I would recommend people read that. Also, priests, we talked about that a little bit earlier, making it into a career or a job rather than a vocation, seeing himself completely consumed. A little ways into the priesthood, a priest, by the time he's 5 years into the priesthood, his whole identity should revolve around his priesthood in some manner, or at least be influenced by it, rather than it being just a 9-to-5 job. You also have to, and so there's all sorts of things that come along with this. I think that they say that the problem is clericalism. I think the other problem is a bit of laicism that's actually ended up occurring. Because with the laicism, what's happening is the lay people are encroaching on areas which were really, the church said, more suited to the priest. And so I think that they need to get the liturgy back to the point where it would form the priest. And you actually see this even among different priests, how they say the Mass, which Mass, right of the Mass they say, is very formative of their mindset about even their own priesthood. And so I think that, and even how they view the church's teachings. So I think that's something that historically the liturgy had a huge impact on the formation of the priest.
And since we're talking about the liturgy, let's talk a little bit about specific differences in the past versus the present. So in the current missal, the Novus Ordo, the 1970 missal, the ordinary form, if you will, it's basically the same. I mean, as much as it's different, it's also the same. It doesn't have a degradation of various ceremonies. There's no proper distinction between a high and a low mass. You can have guitars and banjo at the mass. You can have Gregorian chant at the mass. You can have all these various sorts of things. So there's no provisions really to have ministers that do very much, I should say, because you can have the deacon present, but the deacon doesn't really do anything except what the concelebrants do when they can celebrate the liturgy. We could talk about concelebration, we should probably leave that for another time, because what we want to get to is, and now we look instead at the extraordinary form, or the traditional Mass, going back to St. Gregory the Great. And going back even before him, you have sacred ministers at a solemn high Mass. So you have the bishop, or the priest, and then the deacon and the subdeacon. And we'll talk again about the minor orders in a different context. But so at Mass, you have kind of this dignity and sacredness, and the sacred ministers themselves that are actively participating in the various offerings that are done at Mass. And then when you look at the new rite, those are all kind of stripped down. So if you do get a deacon, he just kind of either pretends to concelebrate with you, or just stands there and says some prayers with you. And there's not really any kind of participation in the rite itself. At least it seems. So how is it that the rites of the liturgy and the solemnness, sacredness, and of that solemn high Mass, how does that contribute to a priest's dignity?
Well, I think that there's two parts of it. One is that with the solemn Mass, there is a sense, any priest that has said it will admit, it gives you, the solemnness of the Mass gives you a sense of the seriousness of what you're doing. And as a priest, that it's very serious business. It's very noble what you're doing. It's very dignified what you're doing. It's something that's completely set apart. It's almost celestial in a sense. It is celestial in the sense that it's a heavenly thing, and it's very different. The advantage of the Solemn High Mass too is that it has, so you have the priest, the deacon, and the subdeacon. And in the, of course, then you have pontifical solemn masses where you have the bishop and the assistant priests and the assistant bishops or assistant deacons, excuse me. And you have several, and there's a whole hierarchy that's established within the sanctuary itself so that it actually helps the priest to see how important what he is doing. And it gives you a different sense of it. So the fact that the sacred ministers are and they actually do quite a bit. I mean, if you look at all the things that the deacon do and the subdeacon do during the solemn high mass, they are integrally brought into the actual liturgy rather than just kind of an appendage that kind of says things from time to time. They actually contribute to what is actually being done, and by serving the priest. The other side of it is then because they take certain functions that the priest would do at low mass, they're serving the priest by performing those things so that the priest can be even more focused on God. One of the advantages that I have found in saying the solemn high mass is that once you become proficient in it as a priest is because certain things are being taken of by the deacon and the subdeacon, your ability to focus, even to pray the mass, is heightened even more. And so that contributes to the dignity of the priest, to the dignity of the liturgy, and it also gives people a sense of hierarchy within the church, because there's the liturgy is supposed to be, as we read in the book of Revelations, it's supposed to be a reflection of the celestial or the heavenly liturgy. And in heaven, heaven's in a hierarchy. And so this gives people a sense of that hierarchy that will be in heaven once we, God willing, get there.
So we've talked about the crisis of the identity of the priest. We've also talked a lot about, especially in the opening remarks, about the crisis of bishops. And I think it's been said before and more properly that the crisis of the church is a crisis of bishops. And some people, and unfortunately one of the things we've seen in trads that's been bad is kind of there's a hatred of bishops. And in many ways you really can't blame them, even though it's still wrong. But because you see this bishop does this, ignored them, supported heretics and homosexuals and whatnot, there's this feeling of abandonment. When you get abandoned, you turn to hating and cursing your father. But historically, I mean, the bishop's part of the apostolic ministry of the church. And as such, he has a job to support his priests. So historically, before the current crisis, what kind of support did a priest normally receive from his bishop?
Well, I mean, obviously we're not talking about financial support, because there's usually some type of financial support.
Right, spiritual, fatherly, etc.
Yeah, I think that there's two things. One is, if a bishop, like if you look at some of the saints that were bishops, their governance of their diocese was so exemplary that the priests would just simply naturally wanted to submit to the bishops in being obedient to them. And so the bishops were true spiritual fathers. And that meant that he looked out for the spiritual well-being of the priest above all in relationship to the priest. So he would he would check to make sure that the priest was saying his office, saying mass worthily, making sure that everything that he needed for the priest's spiritual life, that he didn't become overtaxed or working too hard and burning out. He would make sure that the priest had, the necessary faculties to perform his priestly duties. And the church itself would provide protections for the priest in canon law, and things of this sort. So it was primarily a spiritual support that the bishops would actually give. I think that one of the difficulties that's actually happened in the last 50, 60 years, although I think you could argue it's always going to ebb and flow based upon diocese and bishop and historical circumstances, etc. But one of the difficulties particularly is that bishops have kind of become CEOs, and their dealings with priests have become that same way that they would deal with an employee. Many priests complain that the bishops don't listen to them, although I'm not so sure that they ever did that much, except for maybe the saintly ones. But I think that the saintly ones would actually pay attention, but the bishops need to be more solicitous of the priests. They need to see their priests more as sons rather than as employees or some warm body that happens to staff of parish or things of that sort. There needs to be a better relationship. I think the other thing is the bishops have to do everything to use their authority wisely and justly and charitably in relationship to the priest, primarily so that the priest will be spurred on to develop true piety to their spiritual father, which is the bishop. And this is something that I think is even lacking among the priests. The priests need to have that filial devotion to the office of the bishop, so that even if the bishop isn't perfect, at least that they are having that right ordered subordination to his bishop through that virtue.
Let's talk about mass stipends. Now, so the normal practice is that if you offer the priest a stipend, he'll say mass for your dead relative, or living relative, or whoever it is that you want it applied for. Now, some people tend to look at it, well, isn't that simony? Isn't that paying for the sacraments? So, well, what's the whole theology behind mass stipends?
Well, the whole you're actually not buying the mass, and you're not buying, anything. But basically, what's happening is you're providing for the financial upkeep of the priest so that he can be freed up to focus on providing that service for you. And so ultimately, the mass stipends are there in order to keep they're there in order to provide for the priest financially so that he doesn't have to work or things of that sort. So it's not like you're buying the mass, it's you're providing for the priest so that he can be freed up to serve.
Okay, and was with mass stipends, historically, wasn't that one of the priest's main way of subsisting historically in the church?
Yeah, it was. In fact, historically, the priest didn't receive a salary. Now, some priests had benefices historically, but not all priests did. And then eventually the church, reduced those down to where there's very few priests that I'm aware of, if at all, that have any kind of benefice, which a benefice is basically once you're put in charge of something that you receive kind of money that comes in from that benefice. You're supposed to be using that money for the benefit, for the sake of that thing, but also for your own personal upkeep, etc. But historically, most priests didn't have that, and so the mass stipends they didn't have a salary, and so the mass stipends would provide the financial wherewithal for the priests. Historically, too, the stipends were usually set at an amount that they could actually support the priest. Right now, I think the average mass stipend is about $10. That's now the reason that is still $10, because it's been, the mass stipends has not gone concomitantly up in the last 50, 60 years, with inflation. And part of the reason for that is the fact that now they provide the priest salaries for that. In fact, in some dioceses, they provide the priest doesn't take any mass stipends. All the stipends go to the diocese. The diocese just gives him $300 more a month, for his salary. So that's one way that some dioceses are actually dealing with it. But historically, that was the primary means of the priest's support, that and what they called stole fees, which were like when they did mass weddings or funerals or baptisms. Very often they would give a priest what they called a stole fee. And basically that was just, again, to provide for the priest so that he didn't have to work.
We've referenced them several times, the minor orders. In the church's tradition, okay, we have some of them going back to apostolic times. And so what do we have? Are they apostolic? Are they divine origin? And why ultimately were they removed, as well as what their functions were?
Well, historically, the church has always said, and the theologians and the fathers said, that all of the minor orders are contained within the diaconate, and the diaconate is also contained within the priesthood. So and all of those are all contained within the episcopate. So if you receive the higher, it contains all of the lower. And so historically, even though Christ first, he consecrated the priests, the apostles' priests, and then made them bishops, etc. Exactly how that order is another matter for another discussion, perhaps at some time. But so at a certain point, we have the priests and bishops. Then the fathers of the church say, and the later theologians talk about the fact that the minor orders were already there contained. The church simply unpacked them over the first couple of centuries or so. And so that by the time you get to Gregor the Great, which is 1595 in the codification, long before that, these had been unpacked. And so that there were these orders. So the orders were porter, lector, exorcist, and then acolyte. And the porter his primary job was to ring the bell at the church to indicate to people when to come to church, but also to stand at the port or the door of the church to make sure that people who didn't belong there didn't come in, etc. And then also you had the lector. He would be someone who, during solemn high mass, could lecture the epistle. He was also given catechetical duties, if I'm not mistaken. Then you had the exorcist. Historically, an exorcist who had the minor order of exorcist did solemn exorcisms historically. Later, after Trent and at Trent and Pius V, they subsumed that all into only priests can do solemn exorcisms. It's what we call a potestas. It's not a potestas legata, as some assert. It's actually a potesta restricta, which basically means it's a restricted power that can only be used under certain circumstances. So, and then, of course, then there's the acolyte, and he was someone who was primarily, his job was to serve at the altar at Mass. So he had this minor order. So these orders, and then of course there was tonsure, which is not a minor order, but tonsure was the entrance into the clerical state. So you would enter into the clerical states first, so you would be rendered a sacred person first, before you received any of the sacred orders, any of the minor orders of going up. And so that there was that suitability that actually occurred. After Mysterium Quaedam, they reduced them down to ministries, which basically just to lector and acolyte. They did away with the minor orders, and they did away with tonsure. So basically, and they call these ministries, which the Vatican has said is not the same thing as the orders. The ministries are a permission to perform a function, whereas an order is actually an office which gives you the right to perform that function. So they're very distinct things theologically, and the minor orders were never to be repeated, etc. But the minor orders, that's where they kind of came from. That was their function. Why were they removed? Well, supposedly the reason they removed was to simplify the matters, and also the subdiaconate, which was considered a major order, was done away with. And part of that was because it was considered accretions or things that were no longer had any real purpose, etc., in relationship to the church. And so that's one of the reasons why they simply removed it. The unfortunate part about that is that the minor orders were steps along the way to the priesthood. So as you receive the minor orders, like they do in the Priesthood Fraternity of St. Peter or in the Institute for Christ the King or certain other traditional societies, what happens is as you receive those as steps, your mind becomes more and more conformed to being a priest, so that when you become a priest, it's more part of your thinking as a priest. The other part of it is as you're going through the minor orders, you're receiving the graces that come from receiving the minor orders and going through the ritual of the minor orders and the blessings that are conferred for each order. So there's graces that you're receiving as you're going up this, which once they collapsed that and just made them ministries, do you receive a grace for the ministries? I don't know. No theologians have really speculated on that much that I'm aware of. But basically, once you become a deacon, it does contain all the minor orders, so you have them, but you don't have the graces that you would have had you gone through all those rituals, which I think is unfortunate.
So when traditional communities confer these orders, so did Ministeria Quaedam, did that make it so that these orders no longer exist, can't be used, because then, that these would kind of be empty rituals, which would seem to be a sort of sacrilege when the traditional communities continue to confer these orders. So therefore, wouldn't it be that when they confer the orders, they're actually conferring the actual order, and it's just simply that the modern church has decided not to use these orders?
There was some discussion about it before, the clarification that came from the Pontifical Commission Ecclesiae Dei, and they actually did say, yes, you are conferring the orders. So they actually are conferring the orders. In the new rite, of course, Mysterium Quaedam would still obtain, but in the religious or in the societies that now that have permission to use the old rite pontificale, which is used by the bishops to confer the sacred orders. once they were given concession to the use of those books, the theology is, once they're given concession of that, they're conceded the effects as well. So, because prayer begets what it signifies. So if the church is saying, yes, you can pray this, they're also presuming that you're going to bring about those things, and that became confirmed with that letter, or that clarification from the Pontifical Commission of Ecclesiae Dei regarding the minor orders.
So some people argue that, well, you mentioned it briefly before, these are just steps to ordination. They don't really have any role or ministry. They're just kind of there. You're just kind of, given it. You don't really do anything. So aren't they just kind of redundant accretions? Or should a renewal of the minor orders include, such as in the early church you had deacons, and they were always deacons. They were always celibate, by the way. That's one of those interesting things they don't mention. But because they had to be above suspicion, and they were the ones dealing with all the valuable things in the church. So,
right.
And then so the subdeacon had the job to bring the bishop's communion to all the churches, which is no longer in use in the Roman liturgy, and so on and so forth. So, should with the restoration of the minor orders in traditional communities, should there be various types of work that conforms to that order that they should be doing?
Yeah, I think that would be something that would be helpful. I mean, ultimately, because they're steps in and of themselves, they're worthy of it. And two, the person, as I mentioned, it does help. He receives the graces, etc. But I would be fully in favor of, maybe functions to those minor orders that maybe were not necessarily used or had fallen into disuse or what have you. As far as the exorcist goes, I think that would have to be something the church would have to give some serious consideration to. A lot of the guys that receive the order of exorcist too are usually in the seminary. Could the minor orders be given to those who aren't in the seminary? The answer would be yes, but they would still have to be clerics, at least if you did it the same way that they did historically. Would I be open to that? Yeah, actually, I would be open to it if the church deemed it necessary, and if it was for the good of the church.
Okay, so a lot of priests in the church, in their day-to-day lives, in their parishes, are they feeling, or not, I shouldn't say feeling, it's the wrong word, but are they sensing the high dignity of their calling? Or is there something lacking in their surroundings that where a lot of priests feel like it's open season for them, or they're not really able to function as true priests? And so that they're feeling, kind of down and outs and questioning their vocation. And, do we have the situation where a lot of priests just don't seem to understand what they're supposed to be doing, and what's the solution out of that?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true, that there's a lot of priests. I think a lot of it has to do with they don't understand the identity of a priest. So you still got that particular problem going on. So yes, I do think there's a lot of priests. It's very fluid. In my experience with the clergy out there, there's a very broad range of priests who just feel unsatisfied with what they're doing as a priest because their identity, their focus is everything but what they feel the priest should be doing. All the way down to the priests who are happy as a lark just to sit in their rectory and watch TV. So there's a very broad range in relationship to that. I think that the other side of that is that the priests today feel like, you kind of use the word open season. The priests feel, many priests, not all, feel that they don't get the support from their bishops, and they're very often attacked by the lay people from underneath, and so they're kind of caught between between a rock and a hard place as far as being able to do things that they think would actually help the lay people by helping them to, catechize them on thorny issues like what we've just got done talking about here, or even things like contraception, or matters of the sixth and ninth commandments, or even matters that pertain to going to mass every Sunday. They feel like they can't preach on that because then they'll just get crucified, and the lay people will run and complain to the bishop, and then the bishop comes down on the priest. And so a lot of priests just feel between a rock and a hard place. Now, not all bishops are that way. I think the other problem with grand jury report coming out of Pennsylvania, and the fact that the pedophilia scandal has been somewhat chronically in the news over the course of time, priests, even good priests, feel like they're under a cloud of suspicion right now. That even if they wear clerics still in public, but they know that people are looking at them, et cetera, and wondering about them, et cetera. Not all people. I think most people realize this is a small percentage of priests that cause a lot of damage. As far as the homosexuals, that there's only certain priests that are homosexual, not all are, et cetera. But I think that they're living under this cloud of suspicion. Another thing that we're starting to see is because there's kind of a feeding frenzy that's starting to occur. You kind of saw this in one wave in the past. So like for when there was when priests were accused of certain priests got accused, it opened up the door for all sorts of people accusing priests of all sorts of stuff, and a lot of priests ended up laicized or being stripped of their faculties or their priesthood or what have you as a result of the fact that people were accusing them. And right now you have a situation where people can accuse the priest and the priest has no defense, and he just has to hope that a just system will exonerate him if he's truly innocent. But a lot of times the priests aren't. So a lot of priests are very wary about this, and there's a lot of concern about this. I suppose right now, too, the bishops are in that same seat because of this whole thing that's happened with Cardinal Wuerl and McCarrick, and now that it seems to be going all the way to the Holy Father. So a lot of the bishops, I think, are starting to feel a little bit in that same situation. A lot of the bishops who did do due diligence are having to also pay the price for the bishops who didn't do due diligence, and so now they're under this cloud of suspicion. And so I think that there is that a lot of the priests, unless they have a real clear identity as a priest about who and what they are, they're either demoralized or they're frustrated, unhappy in the priesthood because of the whole myriad of things that have become engrossed in the modern priesthood.
Indeed, and I think especially that's why it's important for people to pray for priests and bishops, because especially we look at just general reaction, internet reaction. Something I said kind of when it broke out initially, and I'm no sage or no prophet, you really don't have to listen to me, but is that you certainly be angry over what's happening, what we can see is legitimately done. But at the same time, don't start going after priests and bad-mouthing priests and bishops every 5 seconds. Instead, what are you doing to get holy? That's how you fix it, is that everyone is still responsible. Just because the bishops do bad doesn't mean that you can ignore your spiritual life, which it seems that a lot of people, for the amount of time they put on Facebook or something of that sort, that's a lot of people do that, in fact. I don't know, does that seem that way to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there is a legitimate righteous indignation about what's happened. However, and they have a right to demand from the bishops that this stuff gets straightened out properly, not just apologize, not just do investigations and then go on with business usually, but something actually be done about maintaining chastity in the seminaries. However, on the other hand, what people fail is that how do they expect their bishops and priests to change if they don't receive the actual graces to do that? And that's going to come principally by the lay people doing prayer, sufferings, and good works for the priests. So the primary way that they're going to help the church climb out of this mess is becoming holy themselves and meriting the graces for the priests and praying for the neglect of their vocations, the neglect in their vocations, their duties, estate in life, praying for the priests that they receive the graces not to do that anymore.
All right. Well, Father Ripperger, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.